How would you like a nice smack in the head?
Not very much.
Well, then shut your mouth and get out of my way with that.
They called it the golden age of Hollywood, a time when stars shone brighter, when the movies were larger than life, and when the world fell in love with the idea of perfection. But perfection, as history shows, was nothing more than a costume, one that hid bruises, scandals, and lives built on control and cruelty. The cameras captured laughter, romance, and light. But behind those cameras stood men and women who ruled their sets, and sometimes their families, with iron fists wrapped in silk gloves. They were the faces printed on posters, their smiles immortalized in black and white film. The kind of people who could stop time with a glance. But if you had worked for them, lived with them, or loved them, you might have seen something very different. Because behind the elegance, there were tyrants. Behind the talent, there were tempers. And behind the smiles, there were scars that never healed. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the truth. These are the 10 biggest jerks in classic Hollywood, the legends who proved that fame can't buy decency, and that sometimes, the brightest stars cast the darkest shadows. Let's begin with a man whose voice defined Christmas, and whose cruelty destroyed his own family. Bing Crosby, the crooner who broke Christmas. To millions, Bing Crosby was comfort, that calm, velvety voice that wrapped around you like a blanket in winter, the man who sang White Christmas and made the world believe in warmth and love. But inside his own home, warmth was a luxury. His eldest son, Gary Crosby, described his childhood in a single word: fear. In his memoir, Going My Own Way, Gary revealed that Bing's discipline wasn't parental, it was punishment. He described his father's leather belt, a thick strap with metal studs, and said it was the real voice of Bing Crosby. If one child misbehaved, all of them paid. Housekeepers told stories of the drowning treatment, where young boys were dunked into bathtubs if they dared speak after bedtime. Behind closed doors, Bing was not the jolly patriarch America saw on TV. He was a dictator in a cardigan. Gary wrote that his father never once said, "I love you." Instead, Bing would chart his sons' weights every Sunday, ridiculing them if they gained a pound. The message was clear: perfection or pain. The scars lasted a lifetime. Lindsay and Dennis Crosby, two of Bing's sons, struggled with depression that never lifted. Both took their own lives, and Gary blamed it on the emotional torture they endured as children. Even outside his family, Bing's coldness showed. His longtime film partner, Bob Hope, privately admitted that he didn't like Bing at all. The friendly chemistry on screen, it was an act. It's a painful paradox that a man who gave the world its most peaceful song created so much chaos behind closed doors. The truth is, Bing Crosby didn't just sing about White Christmas, he lived in a house where everything had to be spotless, even the souls of his children, and that kind of perfection doesn't come without a price. Milton Berle, the clown who couldn't share a laugh. In the early days of television, one man ruled the small screen. Milton Berle, Mr. Television himself. His quick wit, wild energy, and rubber-faced comedy made him the most beloved entertainer in America. People gathered around their living rooms just to see what he'd do next, but behind the applause was a man no one wanted to work with. Milton Berle had a reputation, one that followed him from the stage to the studio. He wasn't just competitive, he was ruthless. Other comedians called him the thief of bad gags because he stole their jokes, their punchlines, even their stage routines, then acted like he'd written them himself. When a fellow comic confronted him, Berle smirked and said, "I only steal from the best." That was his charm until it wasn't. By the late 70s, his arrogance had caught up to him. When he hosted Saturday Night Live in 1979, it was supposed to be a celebration, a living legend returning to a new generation. Instead, it became one of the most chaotic episodes in SNL history. Berle ignored the writers, rewrote sketches, and forced old vaudeville bits into the show that no one wanted. During rehearsal, he demanded the camera crew give him his good side. During taping, he told the audience when to laugh. When he bombed, he blamed everyone else. Lorne Michaels, SNL's creator, was so disgusted that he banned Berle from the show for life. NBC buried the episode. It wasn't rebroadcast for decades. But Berle's worst moment came years later, in 1993, at the MTV Video Music Awards. He was paired with drag icon RuPaul for a funny then versus now comedy bit, but instead of playing along, Berle insulted her live on stage, making crude, unscripted remarks. The crowd gasped. RuPaul was humiliated. MTV never invited Berle back. Behind the jokes, there was bitterness. Comedians who once idolized him avoided him. Younger talents saw him as a relic who couldn't let go of his ego. And maybe that was the saddest punchline of all. The man who made the world laugh couldn't take a joke about himself. Because deep down, Milton Berle wasn't trying to be funny anymore. He was trying to be worshipped. Zsa Zsa Gabor, the princess of scandal. Zsa Zsa Gabor once said, "I am a marvelous housekeeper. Every time I leave a man, I keep his house." That one-liner summed her up perfectly. Glamorous, witty, and unapologetically self-absorbed. Born in Budapest to a family of wealth and beauty, Zsa Zsa grew up surrounded by luxury. Her mother, Zsa Gabor, raised her daughters Magda, Eva, and Zsa Zsa to marry rich, talk like royalty, and always be photographed from the right angle. When Zsa Zsa arrived in Hollywood, she was already playing a role, the European princess who conquered America with charm and diamonds. She wasn't an actress, she was a performance art piece wrapped in furs. But behind the smiles and catchphrases, Zsa Zsa was notoriously cruel. Assistants said she'd fire people mid-sentence. Hotel staff remembered her throwing tantrums if the champagne wasn't cold enough to hurt. Her obsession with image bordered on psychosis. She once canceled an event because she didn't think the lighting would flatter her cheekbones. And then came the slap. June 1989, Beverly Hills, a routine traffic stop. A police officer asks for her license. Instead of cooperating, Zsa Zsa slapped him across the face. That single moment turned her into a global punchline, but Zsa Zsa turned the scandal into a spectacle. In court, she arrived in designer gowns, blowing kisses at photographers. When sentenced to 3 days in jail, she compared herself to Marie Antoinette. Her line on the courthouse steps became legend. "I have learned 2 lessons in life: never buy a car with a top, and never marry a man with less money than you." But the real tragedy wasn't her attitude, it was her daughter. Francesca Hilton, born from her brief marriage to hotel tycoon Conrad Hilton, grew up in the shadow of Zsa Zsa's fame. When Francesca refused to play the part of the glamorous heiress, her mother turned cold. Friends of Francesca said she spent her final years broke, depressed, and barely speaking to her mother. When she died alone in 2015, Zsa Zsa's entourage released a single statement that she was too ill to comment. Zsa Zsa Gabor's life was diamonds and darkness. She collected men, mansions, and headlines, but in the end she couldn't collect love. Because being adored isn't the same as being loved, and Zsa Zsa, for all her glitz and laughter, never understood the difference. Errol Flynn, the hero who couldn't save himself. If old Hollywood had a face, it might have looked a lot like Errol Flynn. He was the man every guy wanted to be, and every woman wanted to be with. The ultimate swashbuckler. The charming rogue who swung from chandeliers, saved maidens, and smiled while doing it. On screen, he was Robin Hood. Off-screen, he was chaos wrapped in charisma. Flynn's rise was meteoric. Warner Bros. Discovered him almost by accident, a Tasmanian adventurer turned actor who looked like danger in a tuxedo. But as fast as his fame rose, so did his appetite for everything that came with it. Money, women, alcohol, and control. By 1942, that appetite had turned toxic. Flynn was charged in not 1, but 3 separate statutory rape trials. He was accused of sleeping with underage girls, one of them just 17. Though he was eventually acquitted, the damage to his reputation was irreversible. The public still adored his movies, but the myth of the gentleman hero cracked. He joked about it too. "I've got to get me a new hobby," he once said, smirking to the press. "The one I've got keeps landing me in court." It was the kind of dark humor only a guilty man could make sound charming. Behind the laughter was a life spinning out of control. Flynn's addiction to alcohol became legendary. He was said to start drinking before noon, chasing gin with champagne, his body aging faster than his fame. By the time he turned 40, studio executives said he looked 60. His once golden skin grew pale, his teeth rotted, his hands trembled on set. He tried to reinvent himself with serious roles, but Hollywood had moved on. The swashbuckler was now a cautionary tale, proof that even legends can burn out from their own fire. His final years were a blur of failed marriages, financial ruin, and scandalous affairs. He once said, "I like my whiskey old and my women young." It was meant to be witty, it ended up being his epitaph. When he died at 50, his autopsy revealed a body destroyed by excess, cirrhosis, heart disease, and organs that looked decades older than they should. The world mourned the charming hero, but those who knew him didn't remember a hero. They remembered a man who never stopped playing a role, even when the cameras weren't rolling. Errol Flynn didn't die young because of fate. He died because he couldn't stop being Errol Flynn. Gene Kelly, the perfectionist who danced on nerves. There's a special kind of beauty in watching Gene Kelly dance, that effortless grace, that joyful confidence. He made rain look romantic and tap shoes sound like music. He wasn't just a dancer, he was an idea, the American dream, spinning on 2 feet. But behind that smile was a man who demanded perfection at any cost. Said Charisse, one of his most iconic partners, once came home from rehearsal covered in bruises. Her husband didn't even have to ask. He just said, "You've been dancing with Gene again, haven't you?" Kelly pushed everyone and himself to breaking point. He'd rehearse for hours, screaming at crew members if the lighting wasn't alive enough, snapping at dancers who missed a beat, and redoing takes until people collapsed from exhaustion. Some called him a genius, others called him a tyrant, and the truth was somewhere in between. Behind his artistry was a deep insecurity. Kelly wasn't born into Hollywood. He came from working-class roots in Pittsburgh, and he carried that chip on his shoulder everywhere he went. He felt he had to prove he belonged, not just as a dancer, but as a man in a world that often dismissed male performers as soft. That pressure turned his drive into domination. his perfectionism also crept into his personal life. He was known to be controlling in relationships, often expecting his partners to orbit around his work. Friends said he could be charming one moment and cutting the next, and then came the political controversy. In the 1970s, rumors spread that Gene Kelly had secretly donated money to the Irish Republican Army. A journalist claimed he'd handed over £20,000 for guns. His widow, Patricia Ward Kelly, later denied it fiercely, saying he would never fund violence. But by then, the damage was done. The story stuck, and so did the suspicion that Kelly's sunny image hid darker passions. Still, on screen he was magic. Even when the cameras stopped, he carried himself like a man trapped inside his own choreography, every move calculated, every gesture rehearsed. In later years he mellowed. The fire cooled, but those who worked with him never forgot the storm he was. Sid Charisse said it best. Gene was brilliant, but he was hard. He danced like no one before him. But maybe, just maybe, that brilliance cost him every real connection he could have had. John Wayne, the cowboy who couldn't take off the mask. Few names are as synonymous with America as John Wayne. The walk, the voice, the presence. He wasn't just a movie star, he was masculinity itself. But behind the image of the patriotic cowboy was a man whose personal beliefs and private behavior made him one of Hollywood's most polarizing figures. Early in his career, Wayne was a liberal, even a self-described socialist. But as the decades went on, something changed. He hardened, he grew resentful, and by the time the 1960s rolled around, he had become the face of right-wing Hollywood. Then came the infamous 1971 Playboy interview. In it, Wayne said he believed in white supremacy until the black man is educated enough to take responsibility. He called Native Americans selfish, defended colonialism, and dismissed civil rights movements as unnecessary. The backlash was explosive. For some, he remained an icon of old-school America. For others, he became the symbol of everything wrong with it. But it wasn't just his politics that made him difficult. It was his ego. On film sets, Wayne clashed with directors constantly. During the filming of The Conqueror, he was cast as Genghis Khan, a role so absurd it's still mocked today. When critics called it offensive, Wayne shrugged and said, "I can play any man, anywhere, anytime." He refused to take direction. He refused to admit when he was wrong. He even once told a young assistant director, "You don't tell me where to stand. I've been standing in front of cameras since before you were born." But perhaps the most tragic part of John Wayne's story is how blind he was to his own contradictions. He spoke endlessly about honor, but cheated on his wives. He condemned violence, but played men who killed without remorse. He hated communism, yet filmed The Conqueror near a nuclear test site that later killed dozens of cast members, including himself, from radiation exposure. In his later years, when students at USC protested having his name on a campus building, people close to him said he was furious, not because he disagreed, but because he couldn't believe people had stopped seeing him as a hero, and that's the real tragedy of John Wayne. He spent his life playing a man who stood for courage, conviction, and moral strength, but when the world changed, he couldn't keep up. He was a cowboy who never took off the mask, and by the time he realized it, there was no one left applauding the performance. Bette Davis, the storm dressed in silk. Bette Davis didn't just act, she devoured the screen. That sharp voice, that razor stare, that absolute refusal to play small. She didn't want to be adored, she wanted to be remembered. But behind her brilliance was a fury that scorched everything in its path. On set, Davis was relentless. She fought with directors, producers, and anyone who dared to tell her what to do. When a cameraman once asked her to soften her expression, she reportedly replied, "I'll give you soft when you give me brains." That was Bette, fierce, witty, and impossible to control. But her temper wasn't just legend, it was fearsome. During one dinner in Beverly Hills, a director dared to wag his finger in her face mid-argument. Bette's response? She unleashed such a brutal verbal tirade that half the restaurant left their tables in silence. When she finally finished, she calmly picked up her fork and said, "Now what were we talking about?" It was more than temper. It was dominance, the kind of power few women in Hollywood ever dared to wield. And yet, that power made her dangerous to work with. On the set of Mr. Skeffington, she nearly blinded herself under the harsh studio lights, using special eyewash to recover between takes. One morning, someone replaced her eyewash with a toxic chemical. The intent was clear. Someone wanted Bette Davis gone. When police came to investigate, the director said, "If you lined up the whole cast and asked who wanted to kill Bette, every hand would go up." Her feud with Joan Crawford is the stuff of legend. During the filming of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, the two actresses turned the set into psychological warfare. Davis had weights sewn into her costume so Crawford would struggle to drag her across the floor. Crawford retaliated by filling her pockets with rocks during a scene where Davis had to lift her. Even off-camera, they waged war in the press, each one feeding Hollywood's obsession with their rivalry. Bette once said, "The only thing I regret is that I didn't give her a real slap." But for all her cruelty, Bette Davis was also trapped by the very system she dominated. She fought for creative control in an era when women were expected to smile and stay silent. She wanted respect, not approval. And in chasing that, she burned every bridge she ever crossed. When she died in 1989, her tombstone bore 3 simple words: she did it the hard way. And maybe that's exactly how she wanted it. Mickey Rooney, the troublemaker who outlived his reputation. If Hollywood ever had a child that refused to grow up, it was Mickey Rooney. He was the face of America's golden youth, singing, dancing, and charming audiences through the Great Depression. But off-screen, Rooney was a hurricane of ego, chaos, and self-inflicted wounds. He married 8 times, cheated endlessly, and seemed addicted not to love but to the performance of it. Each relationship began with fireworks and ended with destruction. He once told a friend, "I've been in love with every woman I've met for at least 15 minutes." Behind the charm was something darker. Rooney's autobiography, Life is Too Short, reads less like a confession and more like a hit list. He bragged about his affairs, exposed private secrets of his friends, and outed people's intimate lives without consent, including Judy Garland, his longtime co-star and friend. Hollywood was appalled. What was meant to be a legacy of laughter became a catalog of betrayal. And Rooney didn't stop there. He publicly shared explicit details about his ex-wife Ava Gardner, one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. Gardner never forgave him. Few did. Journalist Craig Bennett later described Rooney as rude, self-absorbed, and cruel. He treated fame like oxygen, and when it began to fade, he lashed out at everyone who had once admired him. But behind that arrogance was deep insecurity. As a child star, he had been idolized. As an adult, he was mocked. Hollywood outgrew him, but Mickey never outgrew the spotlight. He chased it until his final days, doing interviews, commercials, and small cameos just to remind people he was still alive. Yet even then, his name was followed by controversy, financial disputes, family feuds, and a shocking lawsuit claiming he had been exploited by his stepson. Mickey Rooney once said, "You always pass failure on the way to success." But what he never realized was that he'd stopped walking years ago, circling his own ego until there was nothing left. He wanted to be remembered as the boy who made America smile. Instead, he became the man who couldn't stop talking long enough to listen. Jerry Lewis, the genius who made everyone miserable. No one could deny Jerry Lewis's talent. He was a pioneer of comedy, the king of slapstick, the man who turned chaos into art. But working with him, that was pure misery. On stage, he was electric. Off stage, he was unpredictable, controlling, and sometimes cruel. Lewis co-founded the Muscular Dystrophy Telethon, an annual event that raised billions for charity. But while the cameras saw compassion, many saw exploitation. Critics accused him of portraying disabled children as objects of pity rather than people deserving respect. When confronted, Lewis didn't apologize. He said, "If pity raises money, then pity is fine." That attitude summed up his worldview, results over respect. And it wasn't just his charity work. His co-worker described him as volatile, screaming one minute, silent the next. He would insult interviewers, refuse to answer questions, and walk off stage mid-show if he didn't like the audience. In one infamous incident, a journalist asked why there were so few female comedians. Lewis's response, "A woman doing comedy doesn't look right. They should stay home and make babies." Even in his later years, he defended that comment, refusing to evolve. But perhaps the darkest side of Jerry Lewis was his capacity for revenge. After comedian Joan Rivers criticized his telethon, Lewis sent her a letter so threatening that she hired bodyguards for months. She later said, "He could make the world laugh, but he scared me." His perfectionism was legendary, but so was his cruelty. During one shoot, a cameraman recalled Lewis spending 6 hours berating a young assistant over a misplaced prop, calling him useless until the man cried. By the time he retired, Jerry Lewis had alienated almost everyone who had once loved him. He was a genius who couldn't stand to share the stage, a man so addicted to applause that he mistook fear for respect. And when he died in 2017, his will famously excluded all 6 of his sons. Even in death, Jerry Lewis had to have the last laugh. Charlie Chaplin, the genius who controlled everything and everyone. He was the face of silent cinema, the man who made the world laugh without saying a word. Charlie Chaplin, he wasn't just a movie star, he was a revolution. His creation, The Tramp, became a symbol of hope, resilience, and humanity during some of the darkest decades in modern history. But behind the bowler hat was a man obsessed with control and haunted by his own contradictions. On set, Chaplin was a dictator. He wrote, directed, acted, and edited every frame of his films. He would demand hundreds of takes until his co-stars were exhausted, terrified to disappoint him. Paulette Goddard, his third wife, once said, "Charlie didn't want an actress, he wanted a puppet." His pursuit of perfection crossed into cruelty. He'd berate actors for hours, then claim it was for the sake of art. Crew members described the atmosphere as walking on glass. If Chaplin smiled, you could breathe. If he frowned, you prayed he wouldn't notice you. But his private life was even darker. Chaplin married 4 times, and all 4 brides were teenagers. His first wife, Mildred Harris, was 16 when he was 29. His second, Lita Gray, also 16 when he was 35. Lita later accused him of manipulation, infidelity, and emotional abuse so severe that their divorce case became front-page scandal for months. At 54, Chaplin married 18-year-old Una O'Neill, the daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill. Her father was so horrified that he disowned her. Chaplin stayed with Una until his death, but the pattern was clear: control disguised as love, and then came the paternity scandal. In 1943, actress Joan Barry claimed Chaplin had fathered her child. A blood test proved he wasn't the father, but the court still ordered him to pay support. The trial turned Chaplin into a villain in the eyes of conservative America. Combined with his political views, his outspoken sympathy for socialism, Chaplin became a target of the FBI. In 1952, he left for a trip to London. When he tried to return, the U.S. government revoked his re-entry visa. He never lived in America again. Even in exile, Chaplin refused to admit fault. He once said, "I am what I am, an individualist. I don't bow to anyone," and that perhaps was his curse. He could make millions laugh, but he couldn't live with anyone who wasn't under his control. Charlie Chaplin changed cinema forever. But in his private world, he was the only star allowed to shine. In the end, Hollywood's golden age wasn't golden at all. It was polished brass, shining on the outside, hollow within. These stars built their kingdoms on beauty, charisma, and control. But for many of them, the applause that once lifted them up eventually became the sound that drowned out their humanity. Behind every radiant smile was a fracture. Behind every curtain call, a confession no one would ever hear. Bing Crosby sang peace but ruled through fear. Errol Flynn played heroes but lived like a villain. Bette Davis demanded respect in a world that punished women for power. And Charlie Chaplin, the man who made the world laugh, couldn't find peace in his own reflection. They were not monsters, they were not saints. They were people. Brilliant, wounded, hungry for something that fame could never give them. And maybe that's the real price of perfection. You can make the world love you, but you might forget how to love yourself. Hollywood has always sold us dreams, but every dream leaves a shadow. And in those shadows we find the truth, that greatness often comes at the cost of grace. If this video made you see classic Hollywood in a new light, don't let the story end here. Comment below and tell us which of these stars shocked you the most. Which one do you think deserves forgiveness, and which one went too far? We read every comment, and your perspective helps us uncover the human stories behind the legends. If you want to explore more of Hollywood's untold history, the rivalries, the scandals, and the hidden heartbreaks behind the fame, hit that like, share, and subscribe button. Your support helps us keep digging deeper into the golden lies and timeless truths that shape the icons we still worship today. Because here on The Vintage Legacy, we don't just tell stories, we reveal the people behind the legends. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember, not everything that shines was ever meant to.